Hello, welcome back to Frenemies Season 3, the series where McGuireWoods intellectual property and data privacy and security teams help in-house marketing and legal departments understand each other, work together, issue spot, and maybe, just maybe, go from being frenemies to friends. I'm Neelam Takar, and I'm here today with my colleague Anthony Lay. We're both associates at McGuireWoods with compliance, litigation, and regulatory experience in financial services, and we are passionate about data privacy and fintech. Marketing and legal don't have to be at odds, and we are here to show you how.
Hey everyone, I'm Anthony. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we'll be covering the one where we all are still confused about California. What is in the regulations anyway? If you're watching, you probably already know about the Ccpa. In the Ccpa regulations, the California Attorney General explains and interprets the provisions of the Ccpa. Generally, the recent approved final regs withdrew some provisions and made other changes for consistency and clarity. Today, we're going to discuss some of the key changes most relevant to you: personal information, opting out of the sale of personal information, notice requirements, calculating the value of financial data, and of course, enforcement.
Personal information is at the core of the Ccpa, and the Ccpa applies to the collection and sale of consumer personal information by businesses. So what is personal information anyway? Personal information is information that identifies, relates to, describes, is capable of being associated with, or could reasonably be linked directly or indirectly with a particular consumer or household. So some examples of what would be considered personal information under the Ccpa are geolocation data, biometric data, personal identifiers like your name, postal address, IP address, social security number, email, and even inferences that are drawn from any of the information identified to create a profile about a customer can be considered personal information. So really the main thing to note here, and as explained in the regulations, is that if a business does not maintain information in a way that's reasonably capable of being associated with a particular consumer or household, that information is not personal information under the Ccpa. So by way of example, at first glance, IP addresses seem to clearly fit within the definition of personal information as an identifier. However, if your business doesn't link and could not reasonably link the IP address that it collects back to a particular person or household, it's not personal information.
Now that we know what personal information is, you can imagine it's very common for businesses to sell personal information. In those instances, consumers must be given the right to opt out. The final regulations made 3 clarifications about opting out of the sales of personal information. First, previously, businesses could use the shorthand wording of "do not sell my info." The final regs completely removed these shorthand references, so best practices moving forward is to use the full language of "do not sell my personal information" in your privacy policies and notices. Second, the Ccpa previously had a provision requiring businesses to make opting out easy for consumers. The final regs removed this provision. It's not quite clear why it was removed. It was likely because the regulations are explicit about what methods a business must provide for a consumer to opt out. For opting out by authorized agents, the final regs clarify that a business may deny a request to opt out by a consumer's agent if the agent cannot provide the customer's signed written permission. Now that we know about the changes in the final regs for opting out of the sale of personal information, what's really left? Generally, opting out requirements are still the same. You still need to have at least 2 methods for a consumer to opt out. The first method needs to be a clear and conspicuous link titled "do not sell my personal information." And the second method, and any other methods you want to provide, are really your choice, but they should reflect how you primarily interact with your customers. So for example, if you're a company with a mobile app and you solely interact with your customers through the app, your app should probably include an opt-out function instead of, for instance, requiring the consumer to physically opt out in person. Also, just to remind you, there's other permitted methods under the CCPA, including phone, email, mail, or through the use of global privacy controls. These global privacy controls, those settings must trump any of the other consumers' other conflicting privacy settings. If there's a conflict, you need to contact the consumer and verify what they want. Similarly, if any global opt-out function must be more visible than limited opt-out functions. Lastly, if you receive a request to opt out, you have 15 days to comply, but you don't need to if you think that there's a good faith basis there's fraud. There's going to be situations where a consumer opts out, but then wants to opt back in. These comes up in various ways. For instance, Neela may be super privacy conscious consumer who generally opts out of the sale of personal information for all businesses. But then she could have a change of heart relating to a specific business and want to opt back in. Or she may realize that she values being able to use a certain business's product or service and want to opt back in. In these situations, there's two steps. First, the consumer must clearly request to opt back in. And second, the business must again verify or confirm with the consumer that that person wants to opt back in. Just want to note that the final regs do clarify that regardless of whether a consumer has opted out, the business may tell the consumer that to utilize its product or service, that consumer needs to opt back in and then provide instructions on how to do that.
Now, another big topic that's expanded on by the regulations is the obligation to give consumers notice. The regulations require every business to provide a privacy policy in accordance with its guidelines. Now, most businesses already have a privacy policy containing all kinds of notices and disclosures of rights and obligations, but there are three specific ones that the regulations call out. The first is notice at the collection of personal information. The second is notice of the right to opt out of the sale of personal information that Anthony just went over. And the third is notice of financial incentive, which I will explain shortly. So notice can look different depending on the type of business you are. So if you're an online business or you have an online presence, then notice must generally follow recognized industry accessibility standards for consumers with disabilities, such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the World Wide Web Consortium. Now, businesses that operate a mobile app have to provide two important clarifications regarding the collection of personal information. So first, the regulations clarify that a business has the option of providing a link to the notice of collection on the mobile app's download page and within the application, such as through the settings menu. Second, the regulations provide that when a business collects personal information from a consumer's mobile device for a purpose that the consumer might not reasonably expect, the business has to provide what's called a just-in-time notice, for example, through a pop-up window in the app containing a summary of the categories of personal information being collected and also a link to the full notice at collection. So an example would be of this just-in-time notice would be a flashlight app that also happens to collect geolocation information. Now, geolocation information is not information that a consumer might reasonably expect a flashlight app to be collecting. And so in this scenario, you would want to provide a just-in-time notice of collection. Finally, if you are an offline business that doesn't have any online presence, the final version of the regulations actually removed a requirement that offline businesses provide an offline notice regarding the opt-out of sales of personal information. So this may provide relief for some businesses that would otherwise need EA-related disclosures, perhaps on their store's checkout counter or on a paper receipt. Small businesses but it may go largely unnoticed by consumers, given that COVID-19 and California's stay-at-home orders are keeping so many consumers away from stores. And in addition, it's important to note that the requirement to provide a privacy policy still remains, even if you are an offline business. And the privacy policy generally would explain a consumer's right to opt out of a sale of their personal information anyway. Now, important to point out that previously the proposed regulations didn't allow using personal information for a purpose that was materially different than disclosed in the notice provided at the time of collection. This prohibition is now removed in the final regulations, providing some flexibility to use personal information perhaps differently than for the purpose you originally disclosed. Certainly, this flexibility is nice, but approach with caution. Regardless of California's approach, the Federal Trade Commission previously has prosecuted businesses based on material differences between what the business says it's going to do with personal information and how it actually uses that information. Also, the Attorney General's addendum to final statement of reasons indicates that it may resubmit this section after further review and possible revision. So this relaxation of requirements could be subject to change. A final point about notice, the CCPA allows businesses to incentivize consumers not to opt out of the sale of their information by offering them the benefit of the value that information gives to the business. This benefit is known as a financial incentive. Now, it's important to point out that a financial incentive is permissive, it's not required, but if such a program does exist, consumers must be informed. So, for example, if Anthony has decided not to opt out of the sale of his information to a business, and his information is worth $1 to that business, the business can give Anthony a $1 financial incentive. The more difficult task here is actually determining the value of a customer's personal data. And so the regulations include some factors that a business can take into consideration when determining the financial incentive. Some of the factors include the marginal value to the business of the sale, collection, or deletion of the data, the revenue generated by the business from the sale, collection, or retention of the personal information, profit generated by the business from the sale, collection, or retention of the personal information, or really any other practical and reasonably reliable method of calculation that you use in good faith.
Here's a quick timeline of the CCPA. The AG has declined dozens of requests to delay enforcement of the CCPA, but there's really two key dates you should be aware of. As of July 1st, 2020, the AG may enforce all of the provisions of the CCPA. And as of August 14th, 2020, which is just recently, the AG may enforce the final regulations along with the CCPA statutory requirements. In episode 1, you may recall that our colleagues described the consequences for violating the CCPA. Just to remind you, as it performs to enforcement of the AG can enforce all aspects of the CCPA and the final regulations and seek $2,500 for each violation, or up to $7,500 if the violation is intentional. And of course, there's also a private right of action that any consumer can file for limited qualifying data breaches to seek actual damages and statutory damages between $100 and $750 per violation.
So that's it. Thank you so much for joining us on this whirlwind overview of the CCPA regs. All the episodes in this season, as well as all the other episodes in the series, will be available for viewing on our website. If you have any questions about the content covered or you need assistance with the CCPA or privacy in general, please do not hesitate to reach out to us.